So really just an overview of what Policy 3B says and some of the key information in it as to what planners should be expecting to see on any planning application that meets all the criteria for Policy 3B. Hopefully some of it will be familiar to you already in terms of what it covers around following the mitigation hierarchy and what an ecological assessment should contain. And then a few notes on what to look for when you're seeing a robust enhancement that meets the criteria for the policy as well. I've in the notes section of my slide, you'll have access to later, but quite happy to send more guidance and information afterwards as well to anyone who wants it, because there's lots of established industry guidance out there as well that people can draw upon. So the headline of the policy, and I've bold fonted some of the key pieces are, this is about national and major development or development that requires an EIA, and that's only going to be supported where it can be demonstrated, so it needs to be clear that the proposal will conserve, restore and enhance biodiversity, including nature networks, which we've already heard about, and again, so that they are in a demonstrably better state than without intervention. So that's got to be clearly stated in any planning application that is a national development or has an EIA with it. And that will include future management. And to inform this, best practice assessment methods should be used. There's a little more detail in the policy about what best practice methods should involve. A bit of a steer on what good looks like. I've got a set of criteria here. I've pulled out the key elements of those criteria rather than reiterating word for word all of the policy, but it's there on the Transforming Planning website. So proposals within these categories will demonstrate how they've met all of the following criteria. So it's not pick the easiest ones here that we might see for developers wanting to do. They've got to meet all of these criteria. So there's an understanding of the existing characteristics of the site within its local, regional and national context. And that's a fundamental part of any decent ecological assessment. It's not simply what's been surveyed on site. There's always an element of that information about the site being set in the appropriate context. The policy also requires, rather than merely encourages, consideration of nature-based solutions. So if, for example, you've got a road scheme that requires drainage, we should be seeing some, decent design of SUDs there, including creation of wetland habitats there. An assessment of the potential negative effects, again, that's standard ecological impact assessment. That should be fully mitigated in line with the mitigation hierarchy, and that's prior to identifying enhancements. So it's following the mitigation hierarchy. We heard about that a little bit earlier as well for local developments. It's got to be mitigated before you identify an enhancement. And significant biodiversity enhancements have got to be provided in addition to any proposed mitigation. There's also a requirement to take local community benefits into account. And that links back to things like nature-based solutions, getting the drainage right and bringing in an amenity or a decent green space access as well, for example, or providing screening planting that also provides shade for a cycle path, as an example. So most of this is quite standard and, sets out what's required in an EIA. The key change is that there's now a requirement to demonstrate that you've got an enhancement as well. And that's drawn from the 6th outcome in the 2019 Planning Act and Policy 3 of NPF4 overall. There are links to existing legislation and strategies. We've heard about some of that in terms of the links to other strategies for local development. Same is true for national and EIA developments. So in terms of existing legislation and policy and guidance, biodiversity is a required topic in an EIA now, and there's advice on the content of EIAs in Planning Circular 1 2017. One of the topics that has to be included is biodiversity. You've also got an element in the biodiversity is protected in its own right under, well, these are the main pieces of legislation. There are others. And you've also got the biodiversity duty that I think Brian or Simon touched on earlier. The draft biodiversity strategy also links to this as well. There are targets within there for restoration by 2045 that look at things like nature-based solutions, nature-rich environments close to all communities. So again, for example, if you have a major housing development, not a small one, but a major one, then you are looking at the context of that site. Have you cleared a wildflower meadow? What have you done to not just restore that, but what are you doing to enhance on that as well? And it's got to be close to all communities. So there's a stronger element of bringing in those links between nature and people at the national and EIA scale as well, not simply at local development level. In terms of further guidance on what a good planning application, well supported by a decent ecological impact assessment, looks like, there's established guidelines prepared by CIEEM. The link's on the screen there, and that is kept live. It last had a major update in 2018, and there are area, and that covers the whole of the UK and Ireland. This guidance is endorsed by most of the statutory nature conservation bodies, including Nature Scot. So it's really seen as the industry Bible in how we carry out these assessments. And it's a process that is about identifying and quantifying and evaluating those potential effects of development on biodiversity. And it's repeatable at multiple scales. So you can do it as a standalone piece for a local development, but it's also a fundamental part of any EIA as well. So you would expect to see an ECIA in anything that requires an EIA, anything at national scale. It's a complex area, and rightly so. So we might have an initial set of surveys and desktop study for different habitats. And oh, done a little bit too quickly there. Let me just go back. But one of the most useful tools around is an ECIA checklist, and this is aimed at local planning authorities as well, and it covers a little bit of what you should be expecting to see when you get a planning application in that's got an ecological impact assessment attached to it. I'll just throw this up on my screen here so you can see what it looks like. And it's a fairly straightforward checklist, but obviously there are complexities to it, going through all the different steps of scoping of an ECIA. There's always a screening and scoping process where that's linked to EIA, of course. Have the applicants taken relevant advice from the local planning authority? And have they engaged with the relevant statutory bodies? So Nature Scot, for certain aspects, there should be some engagement with SEPA as well, and obviously the local authority. Relevant environmental NGOs as well are really good sources of advice. So if you have got an upland site where you've got a development like a wind farm or an overhead line that's going to affect birds, a thorough ECIA will have included consultation with bodies like the RSPB, because they do have plenty of local knowledge that would be relevant to that site. Scope, structure and content of an ECIA is in accordance with good practice, and there's some references down at the bottom of this checklist, including to the CIEEM guidelines, and it's got to be adequate and up to date. You know, an ECIA that relies on a 5-year-old survey, well, as someone said earlier, nature's unpredictable or uncertain. It does change. there's guidance from CIEEM on the shelf life of surveys, and generally anything older than about 18 months, you should expect to be seeing new surveys for that. One thing I wanted to focus on is a little bit further down in this checklist. And this checklist was developed about a decade ago. But even within that, proposals to deliver ecological enhancement was already a fundamental part of what you should expect to see in a good ECIA. Not to mention all the outline of mitigation and compensation that's been duly provided before you get to that point. So biodiversity net gain or enhancement, that's already a fundamental requirement there. I'll just flick back to the slides here. There's also a British standard for biodiversity, which talks a bit more about best practice, and it also includes the need to engage suitably qualified ecologists as well. So it's not something that can be done by just anybody. It's got to be someone with the right training and experience. And you should see some statement in an ECIA around the experience and capabilities of the ecologists who've carried out the work. I have unfortunately been involved in some ECIAs where I had to redo the work that people who were not ecologists at all had attempted to do, and they were duly and rigorously directed to have a proper ECIA done by the planning authority in that case. So it does need to be done by the most qualified people, and as I say, it's also required in EIA. We should always be following the mitigation hierarchy. You can do a lot of the most desirable, which is to avoid in the first place, and allows us to be in a better position to enhance biodiversity if we avoid issues. And that can be something as simple as timing. If you are working near a site that is protected for wintering birds, like many of our special protection areas are, well, is the construction happening in the middle of winter, or is it happening in early spring? You can also look at things like location, of course, and many of the larger scale infrastructure projects also have their own industry specific guidance around choosing the best option as regards location, and they will have biodiversity criteria in them. Following the rest of those steps, you're looking at minimizing loss again through timing, design and location, and restoring any damage or compensating. And again, as we heard at the start, that does be tough. Then we get into difficulties of choosing the right sites. We get into issues around just securing the land to create new habitats, which has its own challenges because that takes time to negotiate that if you don't own that land. And a fundamental piece is the long-term management as well. And that's something that has previously been a gap in the delivery on ecological impact assessment. Just as a general piece, that's not even a specific issue to Scotland, but long-term management is key. If you are planting trees that have got a 30-year lifespan, for example, before they become established, never mind actually maturing, then you have to think carefully about the long-term management. So any developer presenting a planning application with an ECIA in it should have set out what they're going to do about that long-term management. It's only at this point that we can think about enhancement really, although it should always be in the back of the developers' heads, even at the outset. It's got to be appropriate. So, for example, a couple of years I was working on a large road scheme, and this was in an upland area. They had to put it where they decided to put it because it was a road diversion. The existing road was subject to lots of landslips, and they couldn't put the new road too far away from its existing area, but they were next to a lot of wet heath. Now, at one point it was suggested, well, let's have some trees to screen this road from view. Not necessarily appropriate when you've got some nice heathland there. So it's got to be appropriate to the development, and it's got to be proportionate as well. another fundamental aspect is monitoring. And I've got a couple of case studies here. Now, these are actually examples that were pre NPF4, but these are publicly available. But just taking this example here, so this is a substation up in Caithness, and the developer here had agreed a set of enhancements already. It was a site of fairly low ecological importance. There wasn't really anything much there. Some non-native conifers. There was shelter belt, and they secured planning consent with some generic wildflower mixes and tree planting to screen the substations from view, mainly as a landscape and visual mitigation rather than an ecological one. Now, voluntarily, this developer has noticed that there was an opportunity to provide habitat for an endemic species, which is great yellow bumblebee in the area. They engaged with the local environmental NGO. They revised their planting plan. They were fortunate in that they had control over the land and were also able to agree a grazing regime to maintain a new planting plan with a local farmer. And so they brought all of these different elements in, and within about a year and a half, they'd secured and begun to establish habitat that supported a locally endemic species, the great yellow bumblebee. It's up here on the CIEEM website as they won themselves an award for this. But going back to the elements of Policy 3B, they've looked again at their mitigation hierarchy. They'd followed that in their original design and planning consent, but then they looked at how they could enhance that. They've engaged locally. There's benefits for local communities there in terms of the local provision of biodiversity, and they've gone beyond what they really needed to do under their planning consent. So this is an example here that would most likely fit the criteria for Policy 3B. That local engagement and partnership working is important in another case study from the Scottish Borders from a few years ago, where we're looking at a balance of land use requirements and looking at what the local development plan within the Scottish Borders Council said at the time, which was around demonstrating that wind farm developers not only show that they've considered options for minimising impacts, but also looking at the biodiversity interest of the site and the surrounding area. Again, that context. They were able to come up with an offsetting plan that engaged with local partners and landowners and provided a series of enhancements that actually incorporated things like improvements for biodiversity, but also nature-based solutions for things like flooding when they looked at their riparian wetland planting and so on. And some of their mitigation and enhancements were focused on locally important biodiversity, so black grouse, upland habitats, and so on and so forth. So it was about getting that context and getting the agreements in place with the landowners, and in both cases getting the monitoring as well. So those are just a couple of examples there. Lots of sources of information as to what is an appropriate enhancement. There are some good examples in the Developing with Nature guidance as well that Simon presented on earlier. I know that's aimed at local development, and it shouldn't be used as the only source of information for a national or EIA development. But CIEEM, carried out by a competent ecologist, should be the most comprehensive source of reference for any enhancement, because it will also draw on some of these other pieces of guidance and information, like the targets in the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, whatever's in the local Biodiversity Action Plan, LDP policies, information from community groups, Nature Scot, environmental NGOs like the RSPB, or local bat and badger groups as well, who are always a good source of local information. What is going to work? Or in the case of the substation example, it was the Bumblebee Conservation Trust who were able to provide advice there. I'll wrap up here. Ecological impact assessments are complex, and I don't need to tell you about the challenges around capacity within local authorities to judge whether or not they've got a good ECIA, but there is plenty of guidance out there. You've got the British standard for what biodiversity and ecological assessments should cover. There's the ECIA checklist, the ECIA guidance, and there's a whole suite of legislation just focused on biodiversity, and that sits outside but is relevant to planning legislation and policy as well. And one of the key things is that all of this takes time to do well. So a developer should be demonstrating that they've engaged early with local planning authorities, with NatureScot and or SEPA and all of the other stakeholders who can help provide that essential context there. All of that would be covered in a development that meets those criteria for Policy 3B. Lots more information, and as I said, I'll provide links to all of these. Some of them are on the bottom of the slides already in the notes pages, but there's tons and tons of information out there. I see there's a few more sources being sent through in the chat, which is great. Okay, thanks everyone.